I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm the instructor for the Proco Figure Sculpting and Portrait Sculpting courses. I was also one of the founders of Figure Sculptors United, which holds figure sculpting competitions among professional sculptors. This video is for those that want to get into traditional sculpting in clay. The most important concept that we're going to be going over is start thin and simple, and then slowly build out the mass and complexity. That's the basic tip for this whole video. So let me explain what I mean by this so that hopefully it's a little bit clearer. The first word is start. You cannot get better without starting. So just start sculpting is the obvious first step, and hopefully if you're watching this video, then you've started sculpting, you've pushed around some clay, and what would be even better is if you've developed a habit of setting aside some time regularly to sculpt. If you haven't started, then start. Grab some clay and begin sculpting. So we're going to start and start thin. For figure sculpting, this means having an accurate armature or wire skeleton. There's a video that goes over my favorite method for building wire armatures on the Proco 3D YouTube channel. I like to use the cranial unit system, which helps me get all of the tricky proportions of the body that we all struggle with to get those all in place right from the very start. So check out that video for more information on building armatures. For portrait sculpting, this means having an accurate side profile and a good block in for the head. The reason we want to start sculpting thin is that it's much easier to build out the soft and subtle forms of the figure by adding little pieces of clay than it is by scraping the clay away with a tool. This doesn't mean that you should never remove clay, and one of the benefits of additive sculpture is that you can add and remove clay as much as you want, but just keep in mind that usually adding clay is a better way to find the forms. The widths are also easier to adjust than the heights. So for example, if the shoulders are too wide or too narrow, that's a quick fix. But if the shoulders are too high on the body or too low on the torso, that's a more serious issue that is more difficult to address. And it's that way with all of the measurements. Now let's go over the second part of that concept. Starting simple and then slowly building out complexity. With figure sculpting, this means thinking about the body as simple forms like boxes, cylinders, or spheres, or a combination of these forms. These are what I like to refer to as the primary forms. There's even an exercise in the Proco Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course where I show you how to simplify the forms and create abstracted figures. This is a great exercise to understand and practice simplifying the complex organic forms into more geometric forms. A good way to visualize this is if you had a very detailed figure made out of wax, and then you were to melt away some of the surface layer. The details of the skin textures and eventually the details of the anatomy would melt away, and we would be left with a much simpler, thinner figure as the layers of complexity are removed. When sculpting, we want to basically reverse this process. So we begin with a thin figure on top of the wire armature, and then slowly start to add clay until the primary forms are established. And then we add the secondary forms like the muscle and fat and anatomy. And then finally we worry about the tertiary forms like the surface detail and texture. A common beginner mistake is adding the anatomy onto an armature without first building out accurate primary forms underneath. This makes the sculpture look strange and amateur because there's no structure. The muscles feel fake and strange, and the proportions are often inaccurate. With the portrait, it's a similar process. In the video on 10 steps to portrait sculpting, I go over how I like to approach the portrait, so if you're interested in a more in-depth look at the method that I recommend, you can check out that video. But just to quickly run through the process, it starts with the references, and then a simple block in. I like to use a wedge shape, and then along the center line I build out the side profile likeness. Next I'll lay in the bony structures of the skull, then the likeness from the front view, checking the sculpture throughout the process. Next is working around the sculpture from every angle, then developing the features, and finally the surface details and texture. Now you'll notice that I say to slowly build out the mass and complexity. Now, I do know some sculptors who do work very quickly I used to think that I was a fairly fast sculptor until I saw Leroy Transfield sculpt, and he's just crazy fast. But his speed comes from years of experience and understanding about the figure. When I first began sculpting, I thought, well, I'll just add more than enough mass as fast as I can, and then I'll remove the extra clay with a tool, and that'll be a faster way to build out the forms. Now, on the surface, that seemed to be a logical way to go about sculpting, but as I became more experienced, I realized that the mistakes that I made by sculpting too fast at the beginning would cost me much more time than if I just accurately and slowly built out those forms in the beginning. This way, slow is fast. Because as I'm careful and thoughtful about each piece of clay, and when the foundation of the sculpture is well made and accurate, then the next stages of the sculpting process are so much easier and quicker. Obviously, there's a lot more to sculpting, but I think this one principle is enough to get beginners started off on the right foot. So remember, start thin and simple, and then slowly and carefully build out the mass and complexity. If you're interested in more of this type of content, then be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Go grab some clay, start thin and simple, and then slowly build out the mass and complexity. Becoming proficient at sculpting is not easy. It's definitely a challenge, but if you're up for a challenge, then it can be very rewarding. Stay creative, stay productive. I'll see you in the next video.